County Master Gardener Association for having me here tonight. It's my first in-person talk to Master Gardeners in over 2 years. I'm a little nervous, not only because it's my first talk in person in 2 years, but because tonight's talk is hybrid. It's a little bit different for me to be teaching in person and online simultaneously, but I was telling some of your colleagues here that in the spring term, I teach a required class at OSU, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 8 in the morning, to students who are largely used to remote delivery of their classes for the past 2 years. So I anticipate that most of my students in my 8 a.m. classes are going to want me to hybrid broadcast to them in bed while I'm there in a lonely lecture hall at 8 in the morning. So thank you for being here tonight to talk about climate change and the impacts of climate change on insects in our garden. For folks who are online, I'm assuming that you can see my slides. If there is an issue with you seeing my slides, then please type something in chat and I'll see it come through. Okay, so I want to start with the take-home messages. And I have to say that when I start talking about climate change, and I've been reading lots of papers about climate change in the recent intergovernmental panel reports over the past couple of days, it kind of bummed me out. It's a lot of bad news, I'm not going to lie. But this morning when I was walking my dog, I'm not making this up, I saw a bald eagle sitting in a suburban park in Albany, Oregon, and it really just made me reflect on how bad the endangered status of the bald eagle was back into the 1970s, and how because people recognized that there was a real danger to our national symbol and took action to make things better, I now regularly see bald eagles around my home in Albany and Corvallis on a regular basis. So I'd like to say that there is hope. There is hope if we take action. So the take-home message is climate change is happening, it's accelerating. We know that in general temperatures are increasing and they're also much more variable. What I mean by that is that it was snowing yesterday at my parents' house in Maryland, and the day before that it was 70 degrees. So we're seeing real big swings in temperature. We also know that precipitation is highly variable from one day to the next as well. Drought also represents a real continuing danger. All of these things do to insects, and in particular specialist insects. Insects that are able to are adjusting by changing their behavior, their phenology, their life timing, as well as their geographic range. Those that aren't capable of adjusting are going locally extinct. Specialist insects in particular, those that have a feeding style where they feed on one group of plants within a taxonomic family, are most at risk, and so are those at higher trophic levels, such as predators and parasitoids. We do know from the Intergovernmental Panel climate change reports that urban and suburban areas are expected to play a key area in adapting to climate change and climate mitigation. And then one thing that I do want to mention that we know from conservation biology and research in conservation biology is that it has been shown that small habitat fragments, such as a garden, are capable of maintaining high levels of biodiversity if they are connected to one another. So we need to start thinking of our gardens, of our parks, of our urban and suburban landscapes, and possibilities for connective corridors, which together can link those small fragments and maintain biodiversity for insects, which are dealing with a lot of stresses. I'm going to go over 3 things in tonight's talk. First, the most recent Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change Assessment Report was released on March 3rd. So it's been heavy on my mind and it really provided a lot of fodder for tonight's talk. I want to go over some of the key findings from that report, as well as from its predecessor from Working Group 1. I'm next going to talk about the impact of increased heat on insects, and then I also want to talk about the impact of increased carbon dioxide on insects. Of course, as gardeners, you likely know that carbon dioxide plays an integral role in photosynthesis. And when we are increasing the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that's having some unique impacts on plant growth, which are having some unique impacts on insect feeding behavior. So as I mentioned, Working Group 2 of Assessment Report 6 of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released the results and synthesis of Working Group 2 on March 3rd. So that's why a lot of this has been on my mind. Working Group 1, I'm going to review some of the key details that came out of that working group, which I've seen summarized as climate change is happening, and yes, we are the cause. Working Group 2, titled Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability, focused on the effects of climate change. I heard that one described as an atlas of human suffering. Working Group 3 is expected to release their report in April, sometime from April to early June of this year. That's where we're going to see the scientists offer solutions for mitigation and adaptation. First, some key results from Working Group 1, the physical basis of climate change. So here on these two slides, I have a timeline from 0 to present day, so the past 2 millennia. And then I have temperature in Celsius on the y-axis right here. Oh, I'm sorry, you can't see it when I'm touching that. So on the slide on the, on the slide on your left is the one I'm going over first. You can see that through most of the past 2 millennia, we stayed within this boundary for temperature. And in the past several decades, there's been a large spike in temperature. And in fact, scientists have documented that there's been a 1.09 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature over the past 4 decades. That 1.09 degrees Celsius increase over the past 4 decades equates to about 1.9 degrees Fahrenheit. Just to put it into perspective, most scientists are at the Paris Accord, where they set climate change and carbon dioxide emission limits. The scientists there set 1.5 degrees Celsius warming as the limit of what they wanted to stay at. There were thoughts that if we passed the 1.5 degrees Celsius mark, that was the threshold that we would pass for irrevocably changing the Earth as we know it. On the slide to your right is the same graph, just 1850 to 2020, kind of blown up a little bit more, showing observed temperature in the black line, and in the orange confidence interval area is showing what is simulated and attributable to human emission of carbon dioxide. In the blue down below is the simulated attributable to natural changes only. And once again, the climate safe future threshold was set at 1.5 degrees during the Paris Accord. We're currently at 1.09 degrees Celsius. I think it's important to note that the Paris Accord really focused on setting a limit on human emissions of carbon dioxide. And in particular, there were targets set for human emissions of carbon dioxide being set to net zero by 2050, and with a goal of having universal, accessible, clean energy available by 2030. Even if we hit net zero by 2050, scientists in Working Group 1 pointed out that now we have a problem. that we're in what's known as a positive feedback loop in climate change because of the progression of the climate towards warmer, more concentrated with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're now seeing continual release of carbon from ecological processes associated with wildfires, the mass mortality of trees from insects, the melting permafrost, and drying peatlands, all of which are ecological processes which are releasing carbon dioxide. So the concern here is that even if we are able to put a limit on our own emissions, that these ecological processes have started that we can't say like, oh, we're going to stop the wildfires and we're going to stop the melting of the permafrost, all of which are associated with increasing CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. I like this little graphic that I found on this one company. A lot of companies have set their own net zero targets. And what I like so much about this one is that they kind of draw out like, yeah, here are all of these things which are emitting carbon dioxide into the air. And we're setting our target to cut our carbon emissions in half by 2030. And then there's just a circle that says innovation. And that's kind of what we see when we look at the early drafts of Working Group 3 of the 6th assessment on climate change. There is this note that we need technological solutions to address some of these issues, but what those technological solutions are, we're not sure if they're going to work or be able to scale up in time. So I kind of like that it's just like a black box of like innovation will happen sometime between 2030 and 2050. Sorry if this is all really heavy. I try to put hope near the end. Actually, in a couple more slides, I'm trying to put hope in a couple more slides. If you can just hang on for the doom and gloom for a couple more, 2 more. So from Working Group 1 of Assessment Report number 6, we do know that virtually over all parts of the globe, whether we're talking about Northwest North America, Northeast North America, Western North America, parts of South America, virtually every part of the globe is known to be experiencing temperature increase. And when the scientists come up with the findings for the working group reports, they say whether or not there's low confidence, medium confidence, high confidence, or irrefutable. So all of these were virtually marked with high confidence of known and documented warming over all regions of the globe, except for a few areas where there's low agreement, such as Central North America and Eastern North America, and 2 areas where there's not enough data, such as Southern South America and Central Africa. Want to talk about the impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, the report that came out from Working Group 2 earlier this month. There were several notations about urban and suburban systems in this report, noting that climate change has caused impacts on human health, livelihoods, and key infrastructure, that heat waves have intensified in cities, where they have also aggravated air pollution events and limited functioning of key infrastructure, and that the impacts are concentrated amongst the economically and socially marginalized urban residents. This is something that if you subscribe to the Hardy Plant Society, or if you're a member of the Hardy Plant Society, I wrote about this issue of urban heat waves and their concentrated effects on those that are most vulnerable. This ties into research that was done by Vivek Chandis at Portland State University, as well as his colleagues, where what they did I thought was really innovative. They took what are known as HOLC maps. HOLC maps stand for Home Owners Loan Corporation. These HOLC maps were common in the 1930s, and they were used to make decisions about whether or not home loans or home insurance were given in certain regions. The Holk maps divided neighborhoods into 4 different sectors, A and B, which are colored here in green and in blue, C, colored here in yellow, and D, colored here in red. And in fact, you may have heard about Holk maps before because they used to be referred to as the redlining maps. What Vivek Shandis and his colleagues did is that they looked at Holk maps for 108 cities across the United States, and then they looked at modern day temperatures in these same neighborhoods. So here's just an overview of where they took the Holk maps and where they constructed modern day temperature maps. The Holk maps, once again, came from the 1930s. The modern day temperature maps came from like 2010, 2012, somewhere around there. They used Landsat data to find temperature. And what they found, I thought, was really earth-shattering, at least for me, that 94% of the cities that they looked at had city scale patterns of heat across neighborhoods that completely reflected what would be expected if you were looking at the Holk maps. So here we have the national means of temperature in the A in green, B in blue, C in yellow, and D neighborhoods in red. And on a national basis, D neighborhoods were 4.7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than A neighborhoods. And what really blew me away is that that was like 80 years later. 80 years after that Holk map was constructed, those cities were still bearing the signature of urban heat, which reflected those formerly redlined areas. And the reason that that was, according to Shandis and his colleagues, is that D neighborhoods were less likely to have tree canopy cover, and they were more likely to be more heavily paved. Tree canopy cover, of course, is associated with development. Shandis and his colleagues in the article talk about how folks in the D neighborhoods historically didn't have the social capital necessary to fight development and encroachment or highways going through their neighborhoods. And over time, that was reflected in increased urban heat. Curiously, Portland was actually the biggest difference between a D neighborhood and an A neighborhood. A neighborhoods in Portland today were 13 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than D neighborhoods in Portland. In the IPCC report, Working Group 2, they do note that green technologies are going to be critical to climate mitigation and adaptation and building sustainable cities for the next decades, centuries, millennia. And they really make a push to invest heavily in these green technologies. And what I mean by a green technology, it sounds so fancy, but it means your garden. Research that was done in New York City found that the raised beds in New York City community gardens were responsible for retaining 12 million gallons of water on an annual basis, which is going to become increasingly important if we're talking about high variation and precipitation events. Gardens and planted spaces are going to be critical to maintaining stormwater surges or resisting stormwater surges and just helping us manage the variability associated with climate that we're starting to see. We already have a lot of that around Portland with the green streets. I stuck this picture in here because that person in the red pullover is actually my husband looking at a Whole Foods in Vancouver, British Columbia. I got that picture into a textbook chapter that I was an author of, and it just made me smile because I love him so much. He's not a scientist. So I just like sticking him in wherever I can. Where I live in Albany, Oregon, the two middle shots are a place which is actually known as Talking Water Gardens. Talking Water Gardens is a place which is a water retention series of ponds that cools water that comes from ATI and MTI to special metal production places before it goes into the Willamette River. And so in a sense, talking water gardens is like a wastewater treatment center, but it's actually a really great place to walk your dog and to take a walk in the evening. So it's kind of like that dual purpose approach to greening up an urban area. Just a note to keep your eyes out for the mitigation report, which is supposed to come with more solutions due sometime in April or June. As I finish up this part, before I get more into the insect communities aspect, I want to know that when we're talking about what's going to happen at local levels related to climate change, it's very difficult to make specific predictions. We know in general that we're expecting and we're seeing increased prevalence of drought, higher heat loads, more variable precipitation, and we now have increased wildfires to the point that we talk about fire as being weather, not just fire, but we actually have fire weather. But the magnitude of the change and the variability of the change that we're expecting to see is going to vary place by place. So it's not only location and context dependent, it's also going to depend upon what happens in the future with future carbon emissions, as well as technologies to deal with increased emissions in the air. That being said, it's going to be even more difficult for me to tell you with certainty what's going to happen with insects in your garden. We do know some things that are going to happen or that have happened. We are seeing changes in phenology, changes in the nutritional content of host plants. We're seeing insects dealing with desiccation and heat stress by altering their behavior or their activity time, even their length or timing of hibernation. We're seeing a lot of rain shifts as well. But we also know that whether or not an insect is a generalist, such as a syrphid fly, which is capable of collecting nectar from a variety of flowers in your garden, versus a specialist, such as something like a cabbage aphid, which is only able to feed on one family of plants, that specialist insects are going to be more prone to disruptions in their life cycle than generalists, and that those at higher trophic levels are going to be even more fragile in the face of climate change. And that all of the impacts of climate change are interacting with other stressors, notably habitat loss, but also pollution, pesticides, and invasive species. So let's talk a little bit first about the impact of increased heat on insects. I'm going to be talking about activity time and novel behaviors, then shifts in geographic range, what we're expecting to see in terms of increased prevalence of pest outbreaks, and then disruptions in food webs. The curve that you see right here with body temperature on the x-axis and relative performance from 0 to 100% on the y-axis is what's known as a thermal performance curve. And insects as ectotherms, as cold-blooded animals, are really sensitive to changes in temperature. In general, there's like a performance, there's a temperature where they do really well. There's a temperature range where they operate pretty good, and there's a temperature below and above which they literally can't function whatsoever. Oftentimes they'll just go into diapause, which means that they shut down their physiological systems and kind of like take a nap until things get better. Or in some cases, they may not be able to deal with the high and low temperature and may not be able to persist. The temperature performance curve is becoming more difficult for many insects to deal with because we're starting to see in many areas, particularly urban areas, that the difference between daytime temperatures, which you see on the left, and nighttime temperatures, which you see on the right, has started to decrease. So that's causing a problem for many insects because they're not able to get rid of their thermal load at night as easily because nighttime temperatures, by and large, are staying warmer for longer periods of time. Just want to give a few examples of how insects are able to adapt. A lot of the research on insects and climate change comes from bumblebees and butterflies. And I think that part of the reason it comes from bumblebees and butterflies is because they're kind of like the panda bears of entomology. Everybody loves them. They've been model study organisms for entomologists for quite a period of time, but they're also easier to study because they're easier to see. So everything I'm telling you about these large, charismatic, beautiful insects, just keep in mind that we know virtually nothing about the small, what my advisor would call like the drizzly, non-exciting, kind of like little brown insects that people don't generally pay attention to. So Edith checkerspot is a model organism for the study of climate change and insects, native to California. It currently lays its egg on this blue-eyed Mary, this Collinsia. And the normal behavior is that Edith checkerspot will lay its eggs at the base of Collinsia. And that's because by laying its eggs at the base of this plant, it avoids being eaten when the deer come through and browse on that flower. But now, because the ground temperature is starting to warm up so much, we're actually seeing evolution in real time, where those eggs are now being laid towards the top of the plant to provide a thermal buffer between the hot ground and the eggs themselves. And whether or not that puts the eggs at greater risk of being eaten by browsing deer remains to be seen. One of the things that scientists have found for this species in particular is that Edith checkerspot's been subject to like a lot of stresses. So heat, habitat development. And so even though it is a specialist butterfly, which used to have an obligate relationship with this hemiparasitic plant, which just disappeared from California with development, it was able to shift to start using Collinsia as a host plant. And then even when Collinsia disappeared, it was able to shift again to use ribwort plantain as a host plant, which is not very common for many species to be able to shift in that real time when their host plants go away. So scientists say that this is actually a story of hope for adaptation, that when Edith checkerspot was put into novel climatic and habitat environments, that we're starting to see the novel expression of all of this genetic variation that previously was hidden because Collinsia never had to draw upon those genes for its survival. And since genetic variation is the raw material for adaptation, it's the story of at least one butterfly being able to adapt in the face of multiple stresses. Last year, when we had those extreme heat waves, a lot of folks wanted to know what would happen with the bees. With honeybees, which are also a model organism that we know quite a bit about, we know that honeybees like to maintain their hive within a narrow thermal window. But honeybees are really lucky in that they are a eusocial insect, which has a lot of workers that can help maintain that hive temperature. When things get too cold, the workers will huddle and they'll shiver to create heat. When things get too warm, you might actually see honeybees gathering water from your water features, which those water foraging bees will take that water and they will literally bring it back to the hive where they'll spit it out, and there will be other worker bees that are fanning their wings furiously. They're literally creating their own swamp cooler to cool down the hive to within the recommended range or within the optimal range for their performance. So if you did want to help out the honeybees in the face of an extreme heat event, you could set out a shallow dish of water, put some pebbles in it. The pebbles will keep the bees from drowning if they fall into the water. It'll provide a good place for those water foraging bees to come collect the water that they will use to cool down their hive. Now, bumblebees are a different story. I mean, when you look at a bumblebee, that bee is built to retain heat. And in fact, some scientists think that the dark bands of a bumblebee are literally there to soak up and retain the heat. They have a lot of fur, a lot of hairs on their body, which further help them to retain heat. And bumblebees, when they get too cold, actually shiver and rapidly fire those big muscles in their thorax to create more heat as well. So they do good in cold temperatures. They can be some of the earliest bees that you see flying in the spring. But when it gets to be too warm, they don't do too well. And they can't fly very well once it hits above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Bumblebees, in order to deal with the heat, can alter their respiration and can alter their circulation so that they dump all of the heat into their abdomen where there are fewer organ systems that can be damaged. They also will spend more time underground. Bumblebees naturally will nest underground where there's a level of insulation and cooling from the heat. They do fan and they do collect water, but no one yet has documented bumblebees doing that swamp cooler thing that honeybees do. So we don't really think that setting out water is something that's going to help bumblebees. Just their ability to persist underground and wait out an extreme heat event is probably how they get by. Because bumblebees are not built to deal with extreme heat, you may expect that the increased temperatures may have negatively affected bumblebee species. And in fact, that's both what we're observing and what is being predicted. What you see on this slide right here is a map of what is predicted to happen to bumblebees in North America by 2070. What they did is they went through museum records and started looking at the presence and absence of bumblebees in different areas across North America. They also tried to model how mobile a bumblebee is and whether or not they're able to escape increased heat by going upwards towards the poles where it's cooler. And in fact, that is what scientists are predicting that they are going to see based upon over 300,000 bumblebee observations from museum specimens across North America. They're expecting to see widespread loss of bumblebee species from 1 to 11 species lost in the lower 48, and in the areas of Canada, expecting to see species gained from between 1 and 9 species gained as the bumblebees migrate northward. Those shifts in phenology and geographic range are fairly common. And in fact, in Working Group 2's report, they cite that 2/3 of all insects are showing some sort of range shift, either poleward in latitude or upwards in elevation. And those that can't shift fast enough are going locally extinct. Our favorite Edith checkerspot, this model organism for climate change, has been known to be disappearing from the lower elevations of its southern limits, from the lower elevations and southern limits of its range. Already talked about local loss of bumblebee species and the shift northward as things get hotter. And the longest running census of butterflies that I know of, that probably anyone knows of, is Art Shapiro's every other week census of 11 sites around the Sacramento, California region. This is Art Shapiro in the middle right here. He's a professor of entomology at UC Davis. What's really incredible about this work that he's been doing since 1972, visiting these sites every other week, and he doesn't drive. So he would either walk or get graduate students or get a colleague to drive him. But for the past 30 some years, every 2 weeks, he goes out to monitor butterflies. I did my postdoc at UC Davis. Not in Art Shapiro's lab, in Jay Rosenheim's lab. And I just remember a new graduate student, like Art Shapiro would come to the entomology seminars every week. And one of the graduate students was like, man, I love it here. What other entomology department do you know that like puts such a hospitable welcome to folks in the community? They thought that Art Shapiro was homeless, but was just showing up at the entomology seminars every week. He's a brilliant man. but not super concerned with fashion. So what Art Shapiro has found in his 30+ years of monitoring butterflies around California is that he's seeing decreases in just about every low elevation species: the monarch butterfly, the mourning cloak, the checkered white, the fiery skipper, the Nevada skipper. In some cases, he's actually seeing an increase in butterfly abundance, but those are at the high elevation sites. So completely consistent with the idea that as climate gets hotter, things are moving northward or they're moving upward in elevation. And these insect shifts are a-okay, but they present a problem for most herbivorous insects, because about 50% of all insects are herbivores, and of all herbivores, we know that about 75% of them are specialists. Even if those specialist insects are capable of moving northward or upward in elevation, they either have to be able to switch the host plant that they feed on or that they use to lay their eggs on, or that host plant also has to make the same trip that they do. And as you may probably be able to predict, animals and plants move at relatively different rates. Most plants can't keep up with that migration northward and upward in elevation that insects are doing. We've seen that climate change driven range shifts in insects is also going to be constrained by habitat availability. I'm going to go through this set of slides fairly quickly because I can see that I'm getting closer to time, and I don't know why I put in a 6-panel graph like towards the end of the talk. I'll try to talk us through it anyway. The top 2 bars are insects for which the scientists have a lot of data. They're very confident in the predictions in the top 2 bars. The middle 2 bars are invertebrates for which scientists have sparse data. They're less confident in the predictions they're making in those middle 2 bars. And the bottom 2 graphs are micro moths, which literally like maybe 2 people on Earth are capable of identifying micro moths to species. My advisor used to call them the drizzly little brown things that nobody cares about. They're really, really hard to identify. So they're kind of all grouped together there because there was no species confidence. On the graphs on the left, we have range shift on the x-axis, and we have number of species on the y-axis. And on the graphs on the right, we're looking at the percent of habitat which is available to the different groups of species. The solid line on the graphs on the left show where the insects would be on that graph if no range shift was going to occur. And the yellow shading for each set of organisms is showing where the range shift has occurred. So we're seeing range shifts on order of 3 to 5 kilometers per year across all insects. And in the dotted line is where the range shift would have to be if the insects were to perfectly track changes in temperature, about 12 kilometers per year. So just showing that insects are shifting, but not fast enough to keep within their optimum range. And the graphs on the right are showing that habitat availability associated with changes in temperature is shifting and shrinking to below 30% of what the historical range had been. So I talked a little bit already about how generalists are likely going to be able to shift much easier than specialists, just because the generalists don't have to worry about their host plant also making that same shift with them. This brings into question what gardeners can do in order to help with these range shifts. And honestly, a lot of this is speculation. I don't really know. But what we're starting to see is that monarch butterflies are shifting northward. It used to be very unusual to see monarch butterflies in the Portland metro region. On the right half of the slide, we see the range map for monarch butterflies that I grabbed off of iNaturalist, verified sightings only. And it used to be fairly common to see monarch butterflies in Medford, and we do see like a big kind of pulse of sightings around Medford, but it's becoming less and less unusual to see monarchs in Salem, in Wilsonville, in Portland. And so in the past, I always used to tell folks, like, you don't need to bother planting something like showy milkweed to support monarchs because you're out of the range of the monarch anyway. But we're starting to see monarchs shift north. And so there may be an opportunity for gardener-assisted range expansion by planting native plants of those insects that may be shifting their range. I want to talk a little bit about the increased prevalence of pest outbreaks. One thing that we do see is that somebody asked, like, why do we see pest outbreaks and things we don't want to outbreak? Why don't we have like a pest out? Why don't we have an outbreak of like something beautiful like a butterfly or something we want to see like a bee? And part of the reason is because pests, their whole life history is basically set up to be like that of a weed, so that they're able to reproduce quickly and build up their population numbers fairly quickly in opportune times. They do really well in unstable environments, whereas those organisms that we tend to not have as many difficult feelings with tend to be more adapted to stable environments. As far back as the early 2000s, simulations were suggesting that forest pests were going to outbreak because they were going to expand their range and they were going to be able to feed for longer periods of time. And anyone that's driven I-5 down through California, through Northern California, the forests are dying because forest pests have expanded their range up north. And in addition, with warmer temperatures, some forest pests are actually doubling the number of generations they have per year with the warmer temperatures. That's what we've seen specifically with mountain pine beetle. In addition, there is this idea known as the plant stress insect performance hypothesis, which suggests that when plants undergo water stress, a lot of insects actually do better, at least for a short period of time. And in particular, sap-sucking insects such as aphids and whiteflies do well under moderate drought intensity. That's because when plants start to experience drought intensity, they start to back translocate amino acids down to their roots. And so for a period of time, it's a party for the aphids and whiteflies and all the other sap-sucking insects. They actually get a burst of protein in their diet when the plant is moderately stressed. Things like bark beetles and wood borers, trees actually have a lot of defenses to naturally resist wood feeding insects. And a lot of that has to do with their sap or their pitch that they kind of like throw out to keep insects at bay. At some point, those defenses are overwhelmed by the insects, and that's why bark beetles are really bad on trees which are drought stressed. I want to finish up by talking about what we know about alterations in host plant nutritional content and what that means for insect feeding. A lot of this information comes from what are known as the FACE experiments. The FACE experiment stands for free air carbon enrichment. In different ecosystems across the United States, these towers of carbon dioxide have been set up to pump excess carbon dioxide into the middle of the circle. And then scientists have been studying what that does for plant physiology. So in this case right here, you can see like the overviews of the towers pumping in excess carbon dioxide. They have some controls that are just repumping in ambient air as well. And they look at the change in biomass in the plants with 0 down right here. You can see that for most plants across most ecosystems that have been studied across 12 years, there is a significant increase in plant biomass. Sometimes we have a spike and it settles down, but it always remains above 0. What that increased plant biomass means is, think about blowing up a balloon. You have like a bigger plant, but the nutrients within that plant are actually diluted. You're increasing plant biomass without a concomitant increase in the protein within that plant. And that's what several studies have shown. In particular, nitrogen, phosphorus, and micronutrients such as zinc are decreased under elevated CO2 conditions. The reason I'm talking about elevated CO2 is because it is the elevated CO2 which is pushing the temperature higher on a global basis. What folks have found is that this actually causes compensatory feeding in insects, that plants which are grown under increased CO2 conditions in the black bars right here, you actually get the insect eating more tissue than plants grown under ambient air, shown in the white bar right there. Insects are eating 118% more tissue, but even with that compensatory feeding, they're still developing to a smaller size, 24% smaller despite eating more tissue. That's another reason that people predict that there are going to be increased pest problems under elevated CO2 and increased global temperatures. Right, so the question was, when the insects eat more tissue, the insects themselves are smaller, and that is, yes, the case. So they're smaller because in particular, they're missing nitrogen and phosphorus. And if you remember back into high school biology, like that, at the nitrogenous bases and the phospholipid backbone of DNA and RNA, they don't have the basic genetic machinery to build proteins which they need to grow themselves. And do they produce more insects? No. Smaller insects produce, in general, less insects than a bigger insect does. So just to summarize how temperature increases affect insect pests, we're seeing increased number of insect generations, more pest problems, and expansion of geographic range. I did not talk about outbreak of plant diseases transmitted by insects, but that's something we're seeing as well. Increased overwintering survival is also going to be associated with more insect pests. Desynchronization of insects and their natural enemies is something which has often been suggested, but it's been difficult to show experimentally. Loss of synchrony of herbivorous insects with host plants has been shown repeatedly, specifically for specialist insects. So I want to finish up by saying, keep your eyes out for Working Group 3's report, which is going to give us some solutions. And I know a lot of what I shared hopefully is like not too much of a bummer. I go back to the bald eagle scenario where we did see, like I did see a species that previously was heavily endangered just in my neighborhood this morning. Like, we can turn this around if we do things differently. And one of the really exciting things for me is that gardens and green space is going to be critical for managing stormwater amongst variable precipitation and weather events, for providing shade amongst extreme heat events, for providing local food amidst disruptions in the global food supply chain. Like, gardens are a huge part of the answer. And building the garden so that we support biodiversity, so that we support local food production, gives me great hope. Specifically, if we can keep in mind that these solutions need to be available to everyone across neighborhoods, and not just folks who already have the knowledge and the resources to take advantage of gardens and all of the wonderful things that they offer.